right, welcome everyone. I'm Scott Cassell, Chief Executive Officer and founder of the Product Stewardship Institute. And thanks very much for joining us on today's webinar, which is entitled Improving EPR Programs Worldwide, the New OECD Guidelines, which is sponsored by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. Now today our speakers will offer tangible ways to improve EPR programs in the U.S. by examining the lessons learned from EPR programs across the globe. But first, let's have a little background. Now for those who aren't familiar with PSI, we have membership from 47 states, also hundreds of local governments. Our board is comprised of state and local agencies, but we also have 110 partners from companies, organizations, universities, and non-U.S. governments. 25% of our partners are in Canada. We also have some in Europe as well. We have a 25-person advisory council, and I'm also on the board of directors for the Global Product Stewardship Council, which is based in Sydney, Australia, and we share information on product stewardship globally. Now, I want to get into some definitions here. PSI's definition for product stewardship and extended producer responsibility, or EPR, as we call it, are a bit different from the definitions used by the OECD. Now, I know that our speakers today will cover this later in more detail, but I wanted to highlight it up front for you. Now, first, PSI's definition of product stewardship is that it covers both voluntary and mandatory programs, and it also covers initiatives that affect the full life cycle of a product or a package. EPR, as you see here in the furthest on the right with the red outline, is considered a legislative subset of product stewardship that's focused on product and packaging take-back programs after consumer use, but which at times it can influence the material use upstream. And we're going to get into that in terms of design for the environment with our two speakers. Now, product stewardship and EPR have producer responsibility as a central tenet, even as other stakeholders do play vital roles. But one key difference between PSI and the OECD definitions for EPR is that the OECD definition does include systems such as deposit return or advanced recycling fees and some other financing systems that PSI does not include under the EPR umbrella. But even though there are these differences, there are certainly enough similarities in the definitions to make any comparison of the programs highly instructive. So today, we're going to be talking about worldwide programs that fall under mandated EPR laws as defined by OECD. Now, there's currently 94 EPR laws throughout the U.S. In 33 states on 12 different product categories. I'm not going to go through them for you here, but you can see all the different categories here in the United States. 94 laws currently. So as the EPR movement in the U.S. Does continue to grow, as it does worldwide, evaluating our current programs is really critical to ensuring success of the programs. At the same time, many nations around the world have had EPR programs in place for a multitude of product categories for over 25 years, particularly packaging and electronics. Those are the two biggest ones worldwide, which Peter and Reid are both going to talk about. As American companies and state and local governments begin to evaluate these EPR programs here in the U.S., we can learn from the challenges and successes that the international programs have encountered and how we can apply those lessons learned to improve our own U.S. programs. So the OECD has compiled these lessons into a newly released, updated guidance on extended producer responsibility. And we just heard right beforehand that we can provide you with the link to this, so we're going to be sending it out. Susie's going to send out a link to this document. As Peter says, it's not in the pretty version yet, but it's going to be in the more beautified version later. But, you know, you'll still be able to read it. The contents aren't going to change on it. For our audience, I think that will just be fine. And the report builds on OECD's original guidance document from 2001. So they've been at this a really long time and provides an in-depth analysis of the key issues and potential benefits and costs associated with EPR programs. So here are our speakers for today's webinar. We have Peter Börkey, Principal Administrator for the Environment Directorate for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. He's joining us from Paris today. And Reid Lifset, Associate Director of the School of Environmental Management at Yale University, joining us from Connecticut. So I will be your moderator today, and I'm going to compile your questions as they come in and ask them of the speakers. And as they speak, I always encourage this, please just send in your comments. Susie is going to give you right now how to do that, how to send in how to use the system and send in your questions. And as the speakers are talking, you should send them into the question and answer box. So Susie, let me hand it over to you, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott, and thank you, everyone, for joining us on today's webinar. It's great to have you here. I'm just going to go over a few how-to items for you. So first, in the lower right-hand corner of your screen, you should see a box that says Q&A. If you have any questions about anything technical, for instance, your audio isn't working or your screen doesn't look quite right, you can type your question in there. Please go to the pull down and click All Panelists. Then Vivian Furman and Amanda Nicholson from PSI, our very apt technical staff, will help you with any questions you might have. Now, if you have any content-related questions, like Scott was just talking about, say you need clarification on a point that Peter or Reid makes during their presentation, you can follow that same step-by-step process and go down to the Q&A box on the bottom right. Make sure you send your question to all panelists by clicking in the drop-down box and selecting All Panelists. If you send to one particular panelist, they might not see it, so always send it to all panelists. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy.
Great, thanks a lot, Susie. And with that, I'd like to transition to our first speaker, Peter Börkey from OECD. Now, Peter, let me just give a little introduction. Peter's OECD's expert on EPR programs worldwide. I'd like to thank Peter for inviting me to present an overview of U.S. EPR programs at OECD's meeting of global EPR experts in Japan a couple of years ago. And so that provided me with a personal opportunity for meeting Peter, but also for PSI and the OECD to work more closely together on EPR issues, and for us to take advantage of the forward thinking that Peter and OECD bring to the analysis of global EPR programs. So today, Peter's going to share some of the insights and recommendations stemming from the recent OECD report that will help you improve your EPR programs here in the U.S. Peter?
Thank you, Scott, for the nice introduction, and I guess good morning to most of you, even though I guess maybe there are also a few participants elsewhere in the world. For me here, it's already the afternoon, so I'm coming to the end of my workday here. But this is a very nice way to end it, I guess. Yeah, I mean, let me start then my presentation really, and I think this is a great opportunity to get some of the key messages out that we've elaborated in the process of the update of our guidance on EPR. So can I have the next slide, please? All right. Just briefly here an outline of what I will be saying. I will begin to provide you with some background about the project that we've conducted over the last few years. I will then speak a little bit to the definition of EPR that we have, as Scott has already alluded to, and talk a little bit about trends. I will tell you a little bit about the achievements of EPR that we see across the world, and then end with an overview of some key guidance elements that are coming out of the updated guidance that we've developed. So that's the outline, and so if I can have the next slide, please, and the next one. Right. So I think, as Scott already said, there were a number of objectives to developing this updated guidance. First of all, I mean, we had guidance which was developed back in 2001, and since then we've essentially seen 15 years of additional experience accumulating, so that it seemed like the right moment to look back at this experience and see where the 2001 guidance needed to be expanded or updated. The objective really was also to assist governments that are now considering introducing new EPRs or actually revisiting existing ones. There is actually, EPR has become a really extremely popular policy instrument with governments. So we've really seen an explosion in the EPR, in the use of EPR, which is now also beginning to be used in many non-OECD countries outside of the OECD region, especially emerging market economies such as China and India. The work was also meant to support parallel work in the European Union, and it's actually drawing to some extent also on the work that's been conducted in that context. So if I could have the next slide, please. The work essentially consisted of a number of steps. We began with a review of the economic literature on EPRs, continued then with the elaboration of a number of country case studies from around 40 EPR schemes, most of them really in the European Union, but we have about 12 or 14 which are non-OECD countries, which include places such as China, but also Chile, Colombia, and Japan, a number of other countries basically which are part of the OECD or soon will be, as well as the United States. And I must thank PSI for the very interesting case study on EPRs for e-waste that they contributed to this work, and which is included in a short version in the report, in the updated guidance. And so then, based on that empirical material, and based also on the discussions of the Global Forum meeting in Tokyo, which Scott mentioned, we then decided to focus the update of the guidance in 4 areas: governance of EPR competition issues surrounding extended producer responsibility, incentives for design for environment and how these can be strengthened in EPR systems, and the role of the informal sector. Essentially, this is a topic which is of particular relevance to developing countries, which we were also targeting with the update. And then finally, the work consisted also and still consists in conducting a number of policy dialogues in emerging market economies, and we essentially developed some interesting cooperation with China and India in this context. And I should mention here that this work has been very generously supported by the European Union, and I want to thank them for that at this stage. So if I can have the next slide, please. So these are the countries that are covered in the 14 non-EU case studies. And in yellow, you have all the countries from the EU. So in total, this is about 40 EPR systems. Next slide, please. And you can see that we're covering the world quite well, I think. Next slide, please. And so I want now to move on and give you a little bit of the substance in the report, and begin by providing you with the definition that we're using. Scott already mentioned about the PSI. PSI's definition of EPR. Our definition is broader, as Scott has already said. We see that we basically say that EPR is an environmental policy approach where producers' responsibility is extended to the post-consumer stage of a product's life cycle. So this then includes a broader array of instruments. It includes the sort of what I would call, well, the most typical and widespread extended producer responsibility systems, which are implemented through mandatory take-back combined with recycling targets, which is essentially the model that you will find in most of Europe, that you will find in Japan and also in Canada, and also in parts of the US. But it also includes systems that use advanced disposal fees as an instrument, systems that use deposit refund as a system. So we're looking at a broader variety, but in reality, the report really focuses very much on the take-back obligation combined with recycling targets version of this. We also do include mandatory and voluntary systems under that definition. Next slide, please. So what I said before is that EPR has really become increasingly popular with governments, and what you can see here on the slide is how the use of EPR systems has really increased almost exponentially since the 1990s. And in fact, more than 2/3 of EPR systems that we were able to identify, and I don't think our data set is comprehensive, so there are probably more systems out there, more than 350 systems. And 2/3 of these were actually put in place after our initial guidance was developed in 2001. Next slide, please. What the data set shows is, first of all, that there is a good third of EPR systems across the world that focus on e-waste, followed by tires and packaging, and then also vehicles and auto batteries. So these are really the main product groups that EPR systems focus on. And as I said, I mean, we're looking at different types of EPRs in our definition, which is relatively broad. As you can see, more than 2/3 of these are take-back, which I call the sort of typical type of EPR. But we also have 17% advanced disposal fees and 11% deposit refund systems, which are being implemented. Next slide, please. So the achievement of EPR, if we can have the next slide, please. These are really sort of the high-level messages that we have on the achievements of EPR. I think generally we do see EPR as an extremely successful policy approach. It has certainly reduced disposal and increased recycling in many places. It has also contributed to reducing the burden that is placed by waste management on public budgets by essentially charging producers, at least for some of the costs that are linked to the management of their products. It has created incredible economic opportunities and allowed the rise of a very large recycling industry around the world, certainly in Europe. This is several $100 billion business worldwide. And the fourth point is where we see sort of the weak spot, which is that, and that was in fact the initial intention of EPR, which was that it was supposed by providing a price signal to producers about the cost of end-of-life management, to provide incentives to producers to better design their products in a way that allows to minimize the cost at the end of life. And I think this is where EPR systems have to some extent failed, even though, you know, there's a more differentiated story to be told there, which I will get to a bit later. So these are the high-level messages, and let me just provide you with a bit of quantitative material to sort of evidence some of these achievements. If we can have the next slide, please. So here, what you see is the trends in municipal waste management across OECD. There are two graphs here on the left-hand side. You can see how the waste that is generated, municipal waste that is generated, has evolved since the 1990s. And this is plotted against GDP and landfill. So what you can see is that where municipal waste management was essentially increasing until the economic crisis, it has then begun to slightly decrease. So this is an average across the OECD. And, you know, despite the fact that GDP picked up again after 2009. So there's a downward trend here, and there's a very strong downward trend in landfilling municipal waste. You can also see that material recovery, and this is on the right-hand side, has increased as a consequence, and also incineration has increased slightly as a consequence of the reduced landfilling. I think at least some of this is, I think we attribute to the development of EPR, which has really helped to take out a significant share of waste from landfills and diverted these into material recovery. Next slide, please. But what we also see is that there are very significant differences across the OECD, and here we've essentially plotted some of the larger economies that are part of the OECD, as well as sort of the extremes. And you can see that between Switzerland, which essentially recycles about 60% of its municipal waste and incinerates the rest and has virtually no landfilling left, and Mexico, which essentially landfills still 95% of its waste, municipal waste. There's a huge discrepancy there, and I think it shows the potential for further improvements of material recovery and also reductions in generation of municipal solid waste across our region. Next slide, please. There are equally different performances of EPRs. So EPRs are being implemented in many different forms, and we'll hear a lot more about that from Reid just in a few moments. But it has certainly been observed that both the environmental performance in the form of collection and recycling rates, and also the sort of cost effectiveness of the schemes in the form of average producer fees here on the table are extremely variable. So just to pick one example, for electric and electronic waste, you range there from 1 kilo essentially of e-waste collected per capita to 17 kilos per capita, and the average producer fees range from 68 euros to double of that. So there are a lot of questions on how you design EPRs in the most efficient and effective way so that they produce the best possible outcomes, both for the environment and for consumers in the form of low fees. Next slide, please. And this slide shows, how EPR in food packaging in the EU has also helped to achieve better packaging design. What you can see on the slide is how the use of food packaging has reduced as a consequence of the introduction of producer fees. And these fees have been in the EU differentiated according to different types of packaging materials. And it has essentially led producers to seek opportunities for lightweighting their packaging and also for substituting packaging material with other types of packaging material in order to optimize costs. So this is a positive effect of EPR on design for environment, we think. But unfortunately, these effects are very much sort of concentrated in the packaging area, where you have charging by weight, and where you have substitution opportunities that are relatively easy to seek. I'll still say a little bit more about this in a moment. Next slide, please. So coming to the guidance. As I said, we developed guidance in 4 areas: governance, competition, design for environment, and the role of the informal sector. I will just be able, unfortunately, due to the limited time that is available, to provide a few highlights, essentially. Can I have the next slide, please? On governance. Reid is going to spend quite a bit of time on this, so I will not speak to this slide. What we do in the report is that we identify different models of EPR governance and discuss the advantages and disadvantages. Next slide. But let me share some of the really high-level and important messages that are coming out of this work. I think what the report says is that really, despite EPR systems being largely run by the private sector through producer responsibility organizations that allow producers to discharge their responsibilities, and recyclers and companies that are specialized in collecting, separately collecting valuables coming into play. This is a policy that requires very strong government involvement in order to enforce a level playing field and in order to enforce environmental standards and targets. Unless this is done, the systems will not run properly, and it is very clear that EPR cannot be run by the private sector on its own. I think that's an important message, especially in places which have no experience with EPR. I'm thinking of places like, or little experience. I'm thinking of places like China and India, which is beginning to develop such systems, and where some policy makers may sometimes have thought that it is basically an outsourcing of waste management to the private sector. And another key message here is the transparency, which is really paramount for the effective oversight by government of these systems, and achieving the points which you can see above there on the slide. All right, but that's all that I will say. I'm sure Reid will very nicely complement and sort of put a bit more flesh around those key messages later on. Can I have the next slide, please? On competition, this is another very important area. I think there has been maybe much less discussion about competition concerns that surround EPR in North America. Then in the European Union, at least this is what the research shows that we've done, and it's also reflected in the paper. Most of the examples that we provide there are from European Union countries. But competition authorities in the EU have been very concerned at times with EPR systems. And the impacts are essentially on 4 different markets. First of all, there can be impacts on product markets, meaning EPR systems can be used to sort of block or increase entry costs into product markets by new competitors, new importers. This is something that has been seen in the past. There's the market which we call the PRO market, the market for producer responsibility organizations, which are the organizations that bring together producers and that provide producers with a service, with a producer responsibility service, i.e. they are organizing the collection and the treatment of the waste, and they are also taking care of the reporting that is required to government authorities. And in this market, there can be one or several competitors, and there's a question there also about the use of monopoly PRO, producer responsibility organizations, which is the case in a number of countries, and the potential disbenefits that this is generating. Concerns also exist at the level of collection and sorting markets, again, where EPRs can essentially stifle competition through vertical integration, for instance, of PROs, and there are effects on treatment markets. I think what's very important, I will not go into discussing the effects in detail because there's no time and it's actually a rather technical discussion, but I think what's very important is, and if you could click maybe, Susie, once more. Yeah, and again, and again, and again. Okay, thanks. Oh, yeah, if you could go back. Yeah. So I think it's important to prioritize these markets. So certainly the impacts on the product markets are the most important ones. So if there are distortions in the product markets, because these product markets are extremely large in financial volume, this is also where the largest impacts on consumer welfare would appear. The market for PRO services is relatively the smallest market because it only represents 5 to 10% of EPR costs. Most of the costs are really concentrated in the collection and sorting markets, with maybe 50 to 80% of EPR costs, and in the treatment markets, 10 to 40% of EPR costs. So I think that is important to bear in mind. Also for competition authorities when they look at potential competition implications from EPRs. So if I could have the next slide, please. So then some of the key recommendations that we draw from the discussion of competition issues is, well, that first of all, before you implement an EPR system, it is advisable to actually develop an impact assessment, competition impact assessment, in order, to design EPR in a competition neutral way. I mean, we've seen quite a few cases where competition authorities have come in ex post and required rather significant changes to EPRs, existing EPR systems, which was a big annoyance then for the industry that have been established around a particular structure. It's also important because PROs really sit at the center of EPR, that PROs are established ideally, as competing entities, and if they're established as a single operator, single PRO, then they would need to it would need to be demonstrated that the net benefits of having a monopoly PRO sort of exceed the costs of diminished competition at that level, in that particular market. And because PROs sit at the center of the EPR sort of system, it is important that PROs use competitive forces when they procure services, and particularly, these services should be procured by transparent and non-discriminatory and competitive tenders. And some key factors here include that contract duration shouldn't be too long, not too long, not to stifle competition in particular markets. Some costs, can be an item or of consideration here in determining contract duration. And there should be a principle of non-exclusivity in those procurement systems. Next slide, please. So those were some of the key messages on competition. On design for environment, as I've said already, we have so far seen relatively little impact of EPR on providing design for environment incentives at the level of producers. This is essentially due to the fact that most EPR systems are implemented in so-called collective producer responsibility rather than individual producer responsibility fashion, meaning producers team up and discharge their responsibilities in a collective way through producer responsibility organization. Sorry, my screen just went dark. Okay, here it is back on. And so as a consequence of that, they are all charged the same cost for end-of-life treatment of their products, irrespective of the design features that their products have and the actual costs that their products generate at the end-of-life stage. So I think initially when we were developing the extended producer responsibility concept, we thought that the producer responsibility would be implemented at the individual producer level, and then those costs would have been reflected one-to-one. But it turns out that economies of scale are such that it doesn't make sense, at least with current technologies and current costs, to implement producer responsibility at the individual level, and the collective producer responsibility is more cost effective. So, in that context, where individual producer responsibility is maybe not an option for the moment, at least, producer fees should be made variable and be preferred over fixed fee systems. In a lot of e-waste EPRs, we have actually fixed fee systems where producers are charged by the unit, a mobile phone or a television set. This should, where possible, be transformed into weight-based systems. Some countries, especially in France, for instance, have gone further, and they modulate the producer fees according to certain design criteria for e-waste in particular, but also for packaging. So if you produce a television set which has no or very low content in mercury, then you get a lower producer fee for that. So that's the spirit of fee modulation as it exists in France. Well, it's not yet quite clear how successful that modulation is in actually triggering further design improvements, but it certainly goes in the right direction. And finally, and that's a very important point, full cost recovery is actually a very important element in providing incentives for better designs. A lot of EPR systems do actually not recover the full cost of end-of-life treatment from producers, but only a share. In the UK packaging EPR, for instance, it's only about 10% of the actual collection costs which are covered through the system. In France, it's about 80% of the collection costs in packaging. So that is not desirable because, you know, one of the ideas of EPR is to implement the producer pays principle. In this case, the producers are the polluters, and in order to maximize their incentive, the price signal that they get on end-of-life cost, it is preferable to have full cost recovery systems. Right, next slide, please. And finally then, and this might be of slightly less interest to all those of you who are based in OECD countries where we have relatively advanced waste management systems and where the informal sector plays a relatively small role, even though, you know, it also exists even in the most developed countries, and end-of-life vehicles are frequently actually dismantled and recycled in non-certified informal kind of operations. So there is still a dimension, a relevant dimension there also for OECD countries. But I think nevertheless the recommendations are really meant for developing countries. And so as I said, I mean, these countries are specific because they have a very large informal sector. In India, for instance, I learned that about 95% of the collection and material recovery is actually carried out by the informal sector. So it is extremely dominant. I think there are different, and that's what we say in the report, there are actually different types of informal sector operations. I think there are certain operations, such as collection and sorting, where the informal sector is actually very effective and largely produces positive impacts by removing material from the environment, essentially material that is being discarded. But then there are also informal sector operations in the actual treatment of the waste and in the actual production of recycled material, and this is usually where the negative environmental impacts, but also health impacts occur because of unsound practices and essentially no care taken to protect the environment. What we've seen in a number of case studies is that, and obviously governments want to possibly encourage, the positive types of informal sector operations and essentially get rid of those that produce negative impacts. Certainly what we've seen in some of the case studies is that failure to include the informal sector into EPR can actually quite severely undermine them by essentially depriving them of the material of the end-of-life products that they were meant to treat and to process. Therefore, the best way that we've been able to identify is to actually support informal sector operators, help them to formalize their operations and to professionalize them by training them and improving their capacity to deal with different wastes. and certainly involve them at an early stage in the discussion around the establishment of EPRs. That is an important sort of lesson that comes out of some of the work. So next slide, please. I think that's my last one. Yes, and so this is, very quickly, and probably I've overshot quite a bit my allocated time. So apologies for that. But that's still a relatively short version of what's in this report, which is now available, which presents the updated guidance, and which is, I think, almost 300 pages. So it is a massive document. So apologies for maybe rushing through some of this quite quickly, but I'm very happy to take any questions later on. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. So you've gone over a little, so we won't be able to hear from Reid. I'm sorry, Reid. We just have to ditch your presentation.
No problem.
Just kidding. Just kidding. So Peter, you had mentioned that the report is available, and so I want to ask the PSI staff. I think that you sent the link to us already. If you haven't yet, perhaps you can send the link, and then we can send it out on this call so people can see this report right when we're talking about it. We will be sending it afterwards. Also, a couple of questions that have come in. We will be providing these slides and the tape, the recording, within 24 hours after the presentation. That will be available to all of you. Also, there's a couple of acronyms here. I know, Peter, you have described them all, defined them all, but just for those that missed it, CPR is collective producer responsibility in the U.S. That would be an organization like Paint Care, or which is for all the paint companies together, versus IPR, individual producer responsibility, which would be like a Sherwin-Williams or a Benjamin Moore taking on that responsibility individually to meet the letter of the law. So whereas Paint Care collectively does so on behalf of all the companies, an IPR system would be where each company itself would meet the law regulation by itself. Also another acronym, ADF, Advanced Disposal Fees. We also call them Advanced Recycling Fees here in the United States, more like the way tires and car batteries and motor oil are managed in the United States. So those are a couple of things I wanted to clarify. Now we're going to move on to Reid. So Reid Lifset is from Yale University. As I mentioned before, he is Associate Director of the School of Environmental Management at Yale. And I've also had the privilege to get to know Reid over the past 5 years or so. Reid is really one of the foremost expert researchers on EPR programs globally. And as Peter mentioned, contributed to the governance section of the OECD report. And Reid was also a featured speaker at that OECD global meeting in Japan. So Reid, you're going to be talking about the governance section. Please go ahead.
Okay, thanks. By the way, I'm the Associate Director of the Industrial Environmental Management Program within the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. Otherwise,
did we promote you?
No, you did promote me. My dean will be rather surprised.
Okay. All right. Well, you should be there, but anyway, thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the study done as part of the overall OECD report. The study is on EPR governance. It used a couple things about the context of the study. It started with a focus on the role of governments, primarily at the behest of the member governments of the OECD who had questions, and then the study evolved to take equal emphasis on overall governance issues. It relies on existing studies and analyses. There wasn't nearly enough time or money to go out and do primary research. So I live and die by what's already been done. Next slide. So the primary considerations in the study, the focus was on what the role of government is in EPR governance, the typical approaches, and what we know about best practice. So the study has a great deal of description of different elements of governance issues. To my, I guess, dismay, much of the content is descriptive. It turns out that identifying best practices is quite difficult because, in general, the data are terrible. And so drawing really rigorous conclusions about what works and what doesn't is more or less impossible. But I'll walk you through some of the things that were found, but I recommend, if you are interested in this topic, to dive into the actual chapter in the study. So let's start with the basic idea. Next slide. So the intuition behind extended producer responsibility is that society is handing over the responsibility for municipal recycling to producers. And so the question is, especially when looked at from the point of view of governments, what is the role of government? Isn't this a form of privatization? Next. And the answer is, as Peter already suggested, not really. That in fact it's a very mixed governance system, partly devolved to the commercial entities and importantly also deeply involving governments. Now keep in mind when we talk about governments, an obvious but important difference between the government as regulator, usually at the national or in the US at the state level, and government as a service provider, quite obviously the local governments, and the issues that, that arise in those respects are quite different. Next slide. Next slide. So what I'm going to do is walk you through a couple different structures. I see that we have lots of questions about acronyms. So a producer responsibility organization is an organization that is sometimes a membership organization or a standalone organization, but generally exists to actually deliver the collection, sorting, and recycling processes mandated by law. They do this on behalf of producers. So this is the collective version of producer responsibility. What you see here on the screen is in some ways the classic version of an EPR system as they emerged in the European Union, where there is some kind of law, government agency that implements the obligations requiring producers or importers or retailers to, on the one hand, register with the government agencies, and that's to show who they are, but also to provide the data that allows the calculation of the actual obligations. And then there's a producer organization where typically the individual producers are members and pay fees to that organization, which in turn contracts out the collection and processing activities. So that's what we saw emerge around packaging and waste electronics in the 1990s. New structures have emerged. Next slide. Where we have multiple PROs, and this exists for quite a few EPR systems for waste electronics, particularly in Europe. And so what happens is that there are competing producer responsibility organizations providing those services, and producers will belong to one or another of those. The multiple PROs emerged in part due to concerns voiced by the producers who felt that what they called the monopoly or single PRO organization didn't provide the services that they wanted. In particular, the producers were concerned about the large amount of financial reserves that the PROs were developing. So the PROs would set fees, the producers would pay them, and then the PROs would turn around and use that money to contract for collection and sorting, but in fact the money going out was less than the money coming in. And so they developed reserves, and there were debates about how large those reserves should be to anticipate changes in the flow of waste or other issues that arose. And one of the responses to those debates was the emergence of competing PROs. In those systems that have multiple PROs, a new form of organization had to emerge, which was a clearinghouse, which does a variety of things, but the main thing in this context is that it allocates collection routes or collection territory among the different producer responsibility organizations. Otherwise, what we would see happen is that the PROs would seek to collect from those areas or routes that were the most cost-effective to meet the targets, leaving aside the territories or routes that were more expensive to collect from. Okay, well, before we move the slide, you'll note that there are two entities shown here that provide the actual on-the-ground services. They are municipalities and they are waste haulers, conventional waste companies. And some, depending on the particular system, sometimes the responsibility goes to the municipalities, which in turn, in some systems, have the option to further contract out those responsibilities to local firms, much as in the United States, in many cases, it is commercial entities acting on behalf of municipalities that provide conventional waste services. Okay, next slide. An interesting variant here is what I call variously the government-run or the no PR approach, no PRO approach, excuse me. So on the one hand, there are systems where there is simply no producer responsibility organization and the government actually runs the whole system. So if you look at waste electronics in China or in Thailand, what you have is essentially the producers paying fees to the government, essentially a product tax, and then the government has a fund which it allocates to, in some cases, local governments to support their activities, or to, as in the case of China, the money actually goes to the MRFs, the Material Recovery Facility, and they implement the system. On the other hand, there are systems, for example, in the US and Minnesota, where there is not a producer organization. And in that case, I'm sure Garth, who's on this listening in, can correct me if I get this wrong, but each year the recyclers provide manufacturers with price offers for the collection of a relevant quantity of recyclables, and then the manufacturers estimate their obligations and decide how many pounds to buy from each recycler, and then contract with those recyclers. Based on forecasts in the contracts, the recyclers create collection plans and or contract with the collectors. So what you see there is a system where there is no collective organization whatsoever, just a relationship between the producers and the collection services. So you can have a, I guess you'd call it a PRO-less EPR system, and you can have a government-run EPR system. Next slide, please. One of the debates that has emerged, particularly in Europe, I don't think we've seen it in the U.S., is the role of for-profit PROs and EPR. They are not uncommon in some countries in the EU, and usually, so they are PROs that are actually commercial firms. They're often owned by waste or logistics companies, and they provide both the producer-facing services of setting the fees and interacting with the producers, and the downstream services of actually collecting and processing in some fashion the waste. There's a great deal of debate over whether for-profit PROs are a good idea or a bad idea, and that debate is intimately intertwined with the debate over whether single or multiple PROs are a better approach. Frustrating the researcher, i.e. me and many others, is that the data are particularly unavailable in this case because the for-profit entities argue that those data are proprietary and shouldn't be released. So it's very hard to get a good grip on exactly how good or bad a job they're doing. A quote here from the European Union study that Peter mentioned, where the researchers argued that what's more important are the actual details of how the competition occurs than whether the PROs themselves are for-profit or non-profit entities. From my reading, one of the biggest concerns is when, in fact, the PROs are owned by the service companies, the waste companies, because it's very hard to see situations in which that will allow full competition for the provision of the collection and processing services. Next slide, please. So now I'm going to move from what are the structures, how are things organized, to the actual tasks that are done under the umbrella of governance. Next slide. So here are some basic governance functions in EPR systems. Obviously, policy has to be formulated, and one hopes that it gets evaluated. There are the core operations, stakeholder consultation, registration, again, identifying obligated producers and getting the data that are needed. And then there's a supervisory process of checking to make sure that the PROs are doing an appropriate job and meeting legal obligations. Another key task is the collection and the disbursement of the fees from the producers. And where you have multiple PROs operating, there's a coordination function and monitoring and, of course, enforcement. Next slide.
Reid, this is Scott. I'm sorry to interrupt. We have a lot of questions coming in. I just want to make sure that we're going to have some time for that. If you can move it up, that would be great. Yep. And then also we'll see if people can stay a little bit longer on for those that have those questions. Thank you.
Got it. So I'll make this one really quick. What we did not find was a correlation between which entity in an EPR system performed which task. There was a great deal of variety, and more importantly, there didn't seem to be a best practice that if you give the stakeholder consultation to the government versus the PRO versus some other entity, we didn't see a pattern that suggested that one way produced better results than the other. Next. So there are a lot of controversies around EPR governance, and I'll just mention one now, which is the role of municipalities. Next slide. So this is the same diagram that you've seen with a single PRO with a little more detail. In some cases, there is what is called dual responsibilities. So the producers actually set up a dual system, much as happened early in Germany, where the term emerged. And in those cases, the municipalities can play a role, but they have no prerogatives. That I think that's part of the debate in some ways in British Columbia. And so what happens is that the producer responsibility organization just chooses a contractor, and that can be a municipality or a commercial firm, to execute its responsibilities, but there's no privileged position that the municipalities have. Next slide. Oh, back. So in contrast, the shared responsibility model says that the municipalities are intrinsically important to this process, so that they have what I would call a kind of right of first refusal in providing services. So they can say, yes, I want to provide collection and or sorting, and then if they want to further contract out to a waste company, they can, but they kind of get that first choice. They are not merely one competing entity to provide local services. All right, let me wrap this up so we can get to questions. Next slide. Next slide. What I found in this analysis is that what's really important are things that are generally not specific to EPR systems. So there's a real lack of systematic monitoring. The collection of data is weak, and there's not a lot of quality control over the data. Many systems are not transparent. There's very little systematic enforcement, and in fact, in many situations, there's not enough money provided to the relevant government entities to actually exercise oversight. Next. This is just about, from the research perspective, how we might find out more things in order to actually give some answers to what is best practice. But let me end up quickly. So next slide. So to wrap it up, EPR is only partial privatization. Governments have a very important role to play. The data are terrible. One can say there are just a few basic approaches with many variants. Unfortunately, there's little to be said about best practice in terms of governance other than those points I've just made, and that we need greater transparency, and we need to do some serious comparative analysis of systems if we want to learn something useful about what works and what doesn't. Thanks.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Reid, and also Peter. And now I'm going to ask some questions here. I'm going to try to combine a number of things together that are coming in, and it's just a tremendous amount of information, and I know that it's hard to grasp for many in the audience. If you can ask your questions and try to be as specific as possible, some of the questions coming in, I'm having a real hard time translating here, and so if you're able to specify, it would be very helpful for me, but I'm going to pull a couple of things together. The first one is on the design for the environment, DFE. And so, we often hear, sometimes people here in the United States will take the one bullet that says, the EPR systems failed on DFE, and say EPR systems here in the United States have not succeeded on DFE and therefore are a failure. Maybe that's an oversimplification, but it's certainly for those that, it's more complicated than that, as both of you have explained. I'd like to open that one up a little bit. So, Peter, you mentioned that in the reduction in the food packaging in EU, there seemed to be, with perhaps differential fees for different materials, then there was an impact on design for certain packages. But then on the other hand, both of you were mentioning, well, it really hasn't been as good because of the collective producer responsibility where, all the companies together, even those, maybe it's on electronics, maybe it's a different product category, maybe on electronics that it just doesn't have the same opportunities for DFE. So I was wondering if you can talk about it from is it the products are different, like electronics versus packaging, where there's more opportunities in packaging, or is it really these type of systems like collective versus individual, or are there some other factors where we can say, EPR will work for design for the environment under these situations, but, it doesn't work all the time, and we might need other policies that are outside of EPR to actually get at that need for changing the design. So if you could open that up for us, both of you. Why don't we start with you, Peter, and then Reid next. Thank you.
Okay. I don't know if my microphone is on.
Yep, can hear you good.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, that's a very good question, Scott. And yes, I would say indeed different product groups lend themselves in different ways to the use of EPR to generate design for environment incentives. So I think packaging is probably the product group that lends itself best for this. also, because, it is really a material fee more than an actual product fee. Because then, a weight-based fee really has some meaning. So you get an incentive to at least lightweight your products, and possibly to look for alternative material for the packaging. Another dimension in there is that most of what packaging is used for, which is essentially food products, are really sort of regional or national markets. So you have regional or national producers who produce for a regional or national market and design their products for that market. So you have a correspondence there between the sort of territory on which the EPR is set up, and the market players and the territory for which the products are designed. Now just think of electronics and electric equipment. These are products which are usually produced by global producers for the global market. So, an iPhone will be identical whether it's sold in the US, China, or France. So there, obviously, when, like in the US, let's just take the US as an example, where you have, I can't remember how many, but I think 25 or 26 state systems which are all set up differently for e-waste, and which all generate slightly different signals and incentives for product design, while the products are really, sort of designed for the global market. This is, where there's a disconnect and where would certainly be a need for some harmonization across EPR systems, I would say at the minimum across the US and ideally, globally, in order to generate stronger signals, stronger incentives across, for the producers. Sorry, that was a long response, but it's a complex issue.
Yeah, let me move to Reid. Thank you for that, and I'm going to be maybe a little bit more, perhaps a little rude here in terms of moving us along to try to get to some other questions in our time frame. But Reid, did you want to add to that aspect about what makes, a system where EPR systems actually have that influence on design and where not? Are there some clear, is it products, is it systems? Can you elucidate a little bit on that?
Well, I think it comes at the core, it's the structure of the fees, what it is that the producers pay, the manner in which they pay, and how the costs of running the overall recycling system are allocated. And as Peter suggested, in many cases these are collective systems, and the systems make decisions on a very simple basis. They allocate the costs on the basis of market share, not the characteristics of the product. The other thing to just reiterate that's important is you can't simply say, here's an EPR system, here's a change in the waste stream, and deduce that the EPR system caused that. There are a lot of other things going on in the market that may change the weight of materials, material switching, so to really pin it down is quite hard. I think the thing to watch here is what's going on in France with the modulated fees, where they are taking a system that is basically run on a collective basis and saying, all right, let's provide a reduction in fees for things that we want and an increased fee for things that we don't like, so that we can overcome this problem of the fees not communicating the right incentives. I think that's where EPR may be going, but we're all waiting to see how good a job the French do.
And that is on the packaging products that you're talking about.
Yeah, I think they're also, I honestly don't remember whether they're extending that to e-waste and the other products that they manage through EPR, but I would be surprised if they didn't.
Right. And as Victor Bell has reminded us, they're called disruptor fees, or at least some of those fees are trying to disrupt and change the materials that are being used. were covered a little bit in our first webinar that we had. So thank you for that. Let me ask Reid, you focused on the governance part. Here's a question from Scott Nickel, and he says he's curious of your opinion about how PRO, that's Producer Responsibility Organization boards, should be structured. Should they be multi-stakeholder, and if so, which stakeholders, or should they just be strictly industry-based?
Next question. No. That's a tough one. I looked in particular at the French system, which has multi-stakeholder boards, and it's not clear how far that got the system in terms of achieving cost-effective recycling. I would say that it's not so much the structure of the board as the transparency of what happens and the requirements for reporting and enforcement that are pivotal, so that we want the public, society, to know how things are being done and how effective they are, and it's getting that data and having the enforcement when it's not working that I think is even more important than the structure of the board.
Great, thank you. Let me ask, here's a question from Bob Paul from the British Columbia Ministry of the Environment, and it could be for either. Maybe we'll start with Peter first. He says EPR reporting is critical to government and other stakeholders to gauge the effectiveness and efficiency of a program. Third-party assurance is a policy practice adopted in British Columbia. What other jurisdictions have developed such a practice?
Okay, I hope my microphone is on.
Yep, I hear you.
Okay, good. Yeah, well, thanks for the question. It's a very good question. And I mean, Reid was pointing out how poor some of the data is that we're getting on EPR. I think, part of the reason for that is also maybe linked to the fact that there is, not always third-party assurance of the data. There are other jurisdictions which use that. Now, I can't precisely remember which ones they are. It's been a debate across Europe to sort of implement sort of mandatory third-party audits of the data and the reporting that is coming out of EPR systems. Now, I'm not sure exactly where it's being implemented. It seems to me that Belgium has implemented this, but maybe Reid has a better overview. Which countries that would be. Certainly, from our perspective, this is a useful tool to ensure data quality.
I have just as bad a memory, but two quick comments about this. What constitutes a third party varies a lot. So there may be a quasi-governmental organization that does this, or in one case, I seem to remember that an actual accounting firm was hired to be that, really an arm's length third party. And in that case, that holds out some possibilities for dealing with the complaints about proprietary information, that if it's a non-governmental entity at arm's length, that may allow a collection of proprietary information that would be awkward or complicated otherwise. Again, I think the most important thing is actually getting the data, and who exactly does that is important, but second to the fact that there is an obligation to provide that data. In the EU report, they talked about both self-auditing, that is, that the PRO had to provide audit information, as well as third-party assurance.
Reid, you've made a point here of saying, look, the data are just not good. You know, you as a researcher, you know, you need better stuff to deal with, really, in order to come to better conclusions. Are there, in the report here, or can you recommend, you know, at another time, or maybe it's a consulting project for you, is there a, you know, if you were to say, what data would you like to have, and what data should governments, state governments, local governments be collecting? You know, what format? Are there standard formats? Because we're talking different programs, different products, you know, different countries. Is that just a pipe dream to try to harmonize some of that stuff? I know it's difficult around the United States, even just on one product category. But, you know, how do we move towards getting better data so that we can have better understanding about how these programs operate?
That's a tough one because, you know, data are the foundation of regulation where it exists. And so obviously different stakeholders are going to react differently to the push for that. Can I point to, well, if you look at the report, there's a somewhat generic listing of the different sorts of data that are needed. And there are a variety of EPR, or a variety of governments that have talked in some detail about what sort of data are needed. I remember reading some reports about this in Ontario, for example. I think an awful lot of this is political will, you know, a willingness.
So you say it's kind of there, but the governments just need to, you know, ask of it from their agencies or they need to ask of it from the producers, and then they need to get it from, you know, from the system.
I don't think it is kind of there. I think one of the big needs is to create the systems that will actually generate the data, and as you said, to harmonize it. But in many cases, I don't know that the data are in fact always collected.
Okay. Let me go to another question here from Bob Paul. This is to Peter. Canada and the EU and the U.S., you know, working to ratify trade agreements, the different trade agreements in the coming years. He asked, do you know if EPR is a discussion matter in negotiations of the trade agreements? Does the OECD have a role to play in this area? Can you bring some of these issues to light, the need for the EPR and all the other aspects of it, like you know, the responsible recycling and other things where we need international standards to make sure that we have a level playing field?
That's a very good question. I have no knowledge of EPR being an issue in the currently ongoing trade negotiations, regional trade agreements. But it's certainly an issue that we looked at back in 2001, actually, when we developed the first EPR guidance. I think to the extent that you know, you follow the recommendations that we have on making EPR competition neutral, then you know, EPR should also be neutral from a trade perspective. So you know, that's a very short and crisp answer, I guess. Actually, I would be surprised if EPR was a subject in the trade agreements, to be honest, because the topic has really disappeared from the radar in the recent years.
Okay. Let me switch gears for you, Peter. You mentioned, you said something like EPR cannot be run by the private sector. And so question is, does this mean that the voluntary systems of EPR, if it's included in the definition of EPR and OECD, does it mean that the voluntary systems cannot achieve the results achieved by regulated systems, or do you mean something else by that statement?
No, I think the statement was just to say that EPR can work effectively only if you know, the private sector operates in a framework that is very clearly set by governments and which also enforces, you know, the same standards on all the players essentially. I think voluntary schemes, because they usually do not cover all the market actors, and therefore allow for a more significant amount of free riding in a way, even though it's not strictly speaking free riding. I mean, they are usually less effective at generating the environmental outcomes. I mean, I think there are probably some market constellations where you are in the presence of a very few, very large players, which can come to some kind of agreement where they all essentially, conform themselves to the same set of standards, and then it can work. So again, you need to look at this case by case. But generally speaking, you wouldn't expect voluntary schemes to be able to perform at the same level of ambition as systems that are mandatory.
And the reason I ask, of course, is because they're here in the U.S. Under the systems that we have, the free market systems. There's a real push by the manufacturers for the voluntary systems, in a sense that when you get government involved, it could actually slow things up. It's less cost effective. It puts barriers in your way, and I think I'm hearing you say that into the EPR systems, at least the way that they're working well, they do need government, they do need laws, they do need regulations, and there's a clear role here for government. Am I understanding you correctly in that?
Yeah, that's correct. And I would say, even voluntary systems, most of the time they're not really voluntary to the extent that usually they come as a response to a government threat of introducing new regulation. And so then basically the private sector tries to preempt that by saying, well, wait a moment, we'll put in place this voluntary scheme and it's going to achieve what you're aiming for. And as I said, I mean, sometimes this can work. I mean, there are markets which are sufficiently concentrated so that free riding isn't all that much of a problem. But there are other markets where it's probably really illusory to think of a voluntary system, performing effectively.
So let me just ask both of you here this question. Do you see the same opposition to EPR in other countries as here in the United States from an increasing number of brand owners? Really, there's only a small number: paint industry, perhaps battery industry, mattresses. We've been talking about this a long time here in the U.S., and there's still, as the number of systems grow, we have 94 here, which is about 1/3, and that's even under our definition, about 1/3 of the worldwide systems are here in the United States. So there's quite a few EPR systems in place here, but there's still a lot of opposition. Do you see similar opposition from brand owners in other countries around the world, or are we unique in that regard?
No, I don't think you're unique. I think there is still opposition, particularly, I think, in the countries and the industries which do not or which are not subjected to EPRs yet. And quite amazingly, or maybe it's not amazing, but anyway, it's a funny fact that some of the globally operating multinationals are actually saying completely opposite things in Europe and in a place like India or China, where they might still be in the business of opposing the introduction of new EPR, while they're sort of supportive of the approach in places like in Europe, where these systems have been rolled out for many years. And where, in fact, the industry then also recognizes the benefits of them, which is that it removes some of the potential liabilities that they might be engaged in otherwise.
Great. Reid, do you want to? I'm sorry.
Yeah, a quick comment.
Reid, do you want to add to that? Go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with Peter, and I think there's a rather straightforward political calculation here, which is when the systems are in place, or it's very clear that they're going to happen, that the potentially regulated entities get on board, because that's the best way to participate in the design and function of the systems. When the systems aren't in place, they oppose them because they're costly. I don't think that's a surprising dynamic. Perhaps the only thing that's surprising here is that companies that say nice things in one jurisdiction and nasty things in another jurisdiction about EPR don't seem to be paying a price for that. That's interesting.
Okay. Let me draw our attention to the time. I am certainly aware that we're at the conclusion of the webinar. However, I do see we have still 2/3 or 3/4 of those who are on the line. And I'm going to ask Peter and Reid, do you have another, say, 15 minutes to stay to answer a couple of these other questions that we've got?
I can.
Yeah. Yes, of course. Yeah, me too.
Sure.
Okay, so thank you. And those that are on the line, please, if you can, stay for another 10 or 15 minutes here for other questions. You can still write in some questions. If you need to leave, please, by all means, go ahead. There will be a recording available of this presentation with the slides within 24 hours. But let's keep going here since we have so many of you that are still on the line. So here's a question from Biljana Spazova. And this is for Peter. He says that he's surprised to see the conclusion, and he quotes here, a producer responsibility organization should only be established as a single operator if the net benefits can be demonstrated. So he says, given what you presented, the PRO market representing 5 to 10% of EPR costs, shouldn't it be the other way around?
Okay, thanks for that question, and I know Biljana actually. Yeah, I've had a few discussions with her already. It's a good question. I think the principle here is that we want to encourage competition at every level and at every market that is relevant to EPR. Including at the level of PROs and the services that they provide. I think it shouldn't be underestimated the influence that the producer responsibility organizations have. And so when they're established as single PROs, they can stifle competition in other markets as well. They can be an obstacle to innovation because there's less pressure to innovate also. But we also see, so that's just typical mainstream OECD. I think you rather go for a competitive system and have market forces play out rather than going for a monopoly. It seems to be quite straightforward to me, at least. But we also see reasons why, in some cases, single PROs might be superior to multiple PROs, namely linked to issues of scale, linked to issues of complexity of government oversight, which is involved when you have multiple PROs, and when you need to establish clearinghouses or a clearinghouse to sort of mediate between competing PROs. It increases the regulatory complexity, certainly that's what we've been seeing in places that have competing PROs. So, we're not saying single PROs should never be used, but we say if you use them, you need to, justify it quite well.
Can I jump in here?
Yeah, quickly, go ahead. Got a bunch of questions.
Yeah, I know of Biljana Spazova's work, although I don't think she knows me. She wrote a very nice master's thesis on this topic for Lund University that I read and enjoyed. I kind of agree with Peter's second part about this. I think that there is an inclination to always look to competition as the appropriate market structure, but I think there are a lot of difficult governance issues with competition. As I mentioned, it's much harder to get the data that allow one to provide oversight on the system when there is competition. the competitors are usually quite vociferous in trying to resist that. There's also there are most definitely cases where competition authorities, or what in the U.S. we call antitrust authorities, have ruled in favor of competing PROs. But I think the bigger issue is the service providers, the collection and sorting entities. I also think we don't really have empirical analysis that takes two systems and shows that, you know, the monopoly PRO situation produces quantitative differences in outcomes. But that's true of all the good questions. We don't have those kind of quantitative analyses.
Yeah, I do know that many government agencies are concerned having multiple plans from multiple producer responsibility organizations, so it's more administrative time. So that's a big concern, I know, from the agency perspective. But as you said, both of you, pros and cons to further get into it another time. Here's a question from Victoria Zhang, and she is from the Ministry of the Environment from China. And her question is basically, how difficult is it for developing countries to establish such EPR systems? Is there any research or data in this?
Okay, this is a good question. I mean, first of all, I would encourage Victoria to go to the report, and there's an entire chapter that discusses, you know, some of the challenges and opportunities of establishing EPR systems in developing countries. I think what we're seeing is that, well, I mean, you know, first of all, the challenges of establishing EPR in emerging market economies are sometimes, yeah, they're quite different, at least in part, from those that you would meet in OECD countries. And to a large extent, that is linked to the presence of a very large informal sector. But also to the
Peter, can I just ask you, can you explain to people that aren't familiar with that what you mean by an informal sector and how it's different than what we would consider a formal sector?
Okay, yeah, good point. I mean, I'm basically speaking of waste pickers, you know, that zoom around the streets or even live on landfills and separate the valuables and collect them. I'm also speaking of backyard recyclers who, you know, burn, you know, electric cables to recover the copper, and they just burn this, you know, sort of open air and expose themselves to the fumes. So, you know, I'm talking about all those operations that essentially happen below the radar, and that's why they're called informal, below the radar of government and of authorities.
And so you're saying, you know, that these systems and designing them, you can't forget about those. As a matter of fact, they're a very significant component, and so you need some way to integrate the informal sector with the formal sector within the context of an EPR program in a developing country. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately the challenge is to transition the informal sector into a formal sector that operates to some environmental standards. And I think that is the way that a lot of emerging market economy countries, such as also China, are actually using EPR. It's the same story, more or less, in India also. So the main objective of EPR is not necessarily so much to increase recycling rates, because material recovery rates are already quite significant in these countries, because they have low cost labor that picks up almost everything that has some kind of value. But the main objective becomes, you know, professionalizing and formalizing the sector and making it operate according to environmental standards that protect human health and the environment.
Great.
And that is it is what I would call a long transition process. It's not something that can happen overnight. It needs to be done step by step.
Let me ask you a related question. Here's from Sheila Kerr. So what are switching from the developing to maybe more broadly a question of metrics. And so she asks, what are the best measures of success? Would you say is it diversion of waste from a landfill or something else?
Well, diversion of waste from landfill is a very, very crude measure, I would say. I mean, I was putting up these slides because there we have aggregated data for all OECD countries, essentially. But I think, usually the success, the environmental success and the environmental effectiveness of EPR systems are really measured in terms of recycling rates, collection and recycling rates. I mean, I think that's what you would really like to look at. I think another interesting metric for the success, which also, because we're focusing very much on quantity of collected and recycled material, but we don't really have a measure of quality. Ultimately, quality is going to, the quality of the recovered material is going to determine, how good we are at actually, closing loops and, transitioning towards a circular economy. And so there, I mean, I think it's interesting to see, how, what the market price for recovered material is, how different it is from primary material. So how it essentially competes with primary material in the market.
Can I add something to this?
Mm-hmm.
I think the first thing to remember is that you need more than one metric. That's especially the case if you're trying to benchmark against another jurisdiction, but in general, you need more than one metric. If you're looking for a summary metric, if you are foolish enough to use just one, I would look at how much, I would measure the quantity of materials that are captured at the back end of the recycling facility. That is not how much is collected in the trucks, not how much is delivered at, say, the material recovery facility, but how much comes out after the sorting process, because that accounts for inefficiencies that, in the system and for contamination. And that we don't want to measure this by how much is collected in the first place, because that will overinflate the numbers.
Sheila's colleague Jay Illingworth asked us a related question and asked if you see a difference in EPR schemes for durable versus non-durable goods. For example, recovery rates might make sense for a beverage container that has a product life cycle measured in weeks, but less so for waste with the WE or electronics that has a much longer life cycle. Would you say metrics are different for the different products?
I would say the metrics can be adjusted. So, look, I work in the field of industrial ecology. We have all the needed methods to adjust for long lifespan products in these kinds of analyses. There's lots of sophisticated ways to adjust these numbers to account for the fact that they're bought in 1 year and discarded many years later. It's a little more complicated, but it's definitely doable. So the basic metrics are the same, but adjustments are made.
I would agree with that. I don't think I have anything to add.
Okay.
It's not an excuse not to measure and report.
All right. All right. I think we've coming to our last question here, and I've got two different places I'm looking, so I've got to ask this. Okay, Joanne Goddard. So she asks, can you speak to the creation and evolving role of third-party authorities that work at arm's length from governments, but help them achieve good governance and monitoring and acting on anti-competitive behaviors? I'm not sure specifically what she's referring to. It could be like a Waste Diversion Ontario, where it's, you have the ministry and then you have this middle third-party authority which, is quasi-governmental, and then you have the stewardship organization. I think that's what she's referring to. Do you see such a role of these authorities, arm's length from government, but still helps them achieve this good governance and monitoring? And so since it's a governance question, Reid, why don't we start with you?
Well, you give all the easy ones to Peter. I don't have a clever answer to that. You see some of these organizations emerging, for example, in the state of Washington, has a quasi-governmental entity, but then there's no producer responsibility organizations in Washington in the same, in the familiar way. Honest answer, I'm not sure. I think a lot of it depends on what sort of demands are made on the system in terms of monitoring and enforcement, but I don't have a clever answer to that.
If I can just come in here also. I mean, I think it all depends on how this third party is set up and how independent it is of the producers. But I think ultimately it's maybe also a practical question. Sometimes while government agencies find it difficult to expand the headcount. And to expand the staff that would be required, to properly oversee, an EPR system, and it may be easier to do that through some kind of third-party outfit, which sort of reports to the government authority and responds to some terms of references. So I think that's also how I would see it. I mean, I don't necessarily see there, being a big difference between, the oversight being conducted directly by the government authority or by some mandated third-party entity that is sufficiently independent.
Okay. Well, we may have a couple of other interspersed questions in here. We'll go through them and see if there's ones we did not ask. We'll send those over to you. We can send them out to those who asked them. But thank you very much, Peter and Reid, for being with us today. The presentations and also the Q&A here is a lot of stamina to go through. It's a difficult, it's one of the most difficult things. We look here in the United States at all the programs, and we do not have the data nor the resources or opportunities to evaluate these programs. It's extremely important. And so, hats off to OECD, Peter and Reid for your analysis here. Whatever we've got is what we've got, and these programs are, as you were saying, Peter, they're really skyrocketing around the globe. Here in the U.S., a lot more, but it's very impressive around the globe in a lot of different systems. So really appreciate the insight that you've provided us here on the call. And also, Peter, thank you for sponsoring this webinar. So let me wrap up here, and speaking to the audience now, you should be aware that all of our webinars and web conferences are taped, like this one, and they'll be posted on the website within 24 hours, as I've mentioned before, and you can get access to other webinars that you might have missed. You can go into the events, the webinars, and then click there, and you should be able to access them all. Now, as soon as this webinar ends, you'll see an evaluation form that pops up. If you could please, fill that out. Just take a couple of minutes. Give us your thoughts. Tell us what you liked, what you'd like to see more of, what you'd like to see changes in, additional webinars, webinars. Any information you have for us would be greatly appreciated, and so that we can deliver to you what it is that you most would like to see. And so we have a couple of other webinars that are going to come up. We're going to take a break for the summer. We are going to have one on EPR and the circular economy. Unfortunately, that one was canceled earlier in last month because both of our speakers in the last minute had personal emergencies that they had to attend to, and we need to reschedule. So that will take place in September, a really important one, and I think we'll build on this one here for the OECD. We're going to have two other packaging webinars, one on packaging and the impact on recyclers and waste management companies, and the other on the impact of the price of goods and our favorite topic that we talked about here, design for the environment. And so we're looking forward to those. All those will take place starting in September. So once again, thanks very much, all of you that stayed with us here for the extra time. Really appreciate it. And a big thank you again to Peter and Reid. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And Peter, have a good evening.
Yeah, you too, Scott. Bye-bye.
All right, thanks. And Reid, have a nice afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thanks.